He was very excited to go. This was in late 1831, supposed to leave a couple of months earlier, but the weather had been so bad. A couple of times they got a little bit out into the harbor and had to turn around. Darwin had read in von Humboldt's book a description of the lush tropical vegetation of the Canary Islands. So he was very eager to get there. In fact, he had tried to organize a field trip to the Canary Islands with some of his fellow students when he was still in Cambridge, but that never happened. From the very first stop, he was comparing fossils with the living analogs, which, you know, he had to know about Brocchi and Lamarck to even think about doing something like that. So they came to Salvador de Bahia, which was Darwin's first chance to see tropical vegetation. The mind is a chaos of delight, he said. And then eventually down to Rio, and so forth. But they spend most of their time going up and down. Bahia Blanca is right here.
Estamos en la barranca de Montehermoso, donde estuvo Darwin en 1832 y donde encontró fósiles de mamíferos. Lo fabuloso de este sitio es que está conservado exactamente como lo fue Darwin, como lo vio Darwin, hasta con la vegetación nativa y los mismos aves que volaban alrededor de la gente que recorría con él estas barrancas.
When they got to Bahia Blanca in northeastern coast of Argentina, that things started getting hot very fast.
Podemos ver los invertebrados marinos actuales, son las conchillas de invertebrados marinos actuales, que son las mismas especies que encontró Darwin en Punta Alta. Probablemente Darwin vio en este lugar, vio esta fauna, y de ahí los comparó con los que encontró en Punta Alta. Estamos en una cantera de conchillas del Holoceno, que está ubicada a una distancia de unos 2000 metros, continente adentro, de la barranca de Punta Alta, donde Darwin encontró restos de mamíferos juntos con invertebrados marinos, principalmente bivalvos y gastrópodos.
Contrast to that, though, he saw that the bones were these gigantic, large mammals like Megatherium, which had been described by Cuvier already, so it was known in Europe about these creatures. And what was not really known, though, were the glyptodonts, which look like armadillos, but are much, much bigger, and they have this carapace of tessellated bones and so forth. He started picking up fragments, and they actually picked up a huge fragment of that.
Particularly once he starts getting to South America, that he really gets interested in this question. And I think it is, in many ways, the question of the South American mammals that really starts to fascinate him. Partly because, you know, you see like armadillos walking around. It's quite strange, you know, he's a kid from Shropshire and suddenly you've got armadillos there, but then underneath the ground you have huge armadillos and glyptodons and other things. And you wonder, well, you know, what's going on there?
Es una placa de un caparazón de los gliptodontes, esos grandes armadillos, y que parecidas a estas, Darwin encontró en la barranca de Punta Alta, le llamaron la atención. En principio pensó que pertenecían al megaterio, de acuerdo a una descripción que había leído de Cuvier, pero después se dio cuenta que no, que era de un animal más relacionado con los armadillos terrestres, que él veía en ese momento en la región de la barranca de Punta Alta.
I think he must have had those tables in mind that Jameson had in his book, showing that there's a differential rate of extinction of species within genera depending in different kinds of groups. At Monte Hermoso, the real big action starts because he finds a fossil rodent. It's clearly a rodent. It's got a beautiful jaw. He thought it was a species lesser than, a smaller version of the living Patagonian mara. So he got excited because he thought he had an extinct fossil that was in the same lineage as the living species. So he had three things. He had living mollusks, in the fossil record. He had extinct mammals in the fossil record that were clearly related to living species but were not the same. And then he had this, what he thought was one really good example of an extinct species but belonging and very close relative of the living Patagonian cavy. In November of 1832, he received Lyell's second volume, which was this attack on Lamarck's work and thinking. And he must have devoured that book. That might be the first time, although I doubt it, that he sees Brocchi's name. It was no later than 1832 that he learned about Brocchi, because Brocchi's ideas were again accurately summarized, although not fully summarized, in Lyell's books. Down there, though, at Bahia Blanca, he encounters a poisonous snake. He knew it was poisonous. It was not the most aggressive of this particular group. It's the fer de lance, and he killed one. He shot one, and he finds out that there's something funny about the end of the tail on this thing. It's a hard sort of a casque. He says it's halfway between an adder like we have in England and the European adders that don't have any structure to the tail at the end, and the true American rattlesnakes. I thought that was kind of interesting that he would still point out the intermediate anatomical intermediacy between the adders and the more perfect organ of what he called the more perfect organ of the true rattlesnake. So the Indians in South America, or whoever took an interest in wildlife, said to him, you know, there's two kinds of ostriches out there in Patagonia. The one in the south is a little smaller. It's got bluer eggs. The distinction, kind of hard to see, but they're obviously close relatives. He was out with Conrad Martins, who's the painter, very skilled painter on ship. Guess he was also a good hunter. They were out on horseback trying to shoot Christmas dinner. And Darwin shot one of the camels, a guanaco, and Martin shot a small rhea. He was sitting eating Christmas dinner, and he picked up a bone of this rhea, and he started looking at it, and most of the specimen had been removed all the way back down to the kitchen, and unfortunately already the bones had been thrown overboard. But he said, oh my God, this has got to be this other species. It's smaller, it's this and it's that. And he went racing down to the galley, and he was able to save the head, the neck, I think one leg and a wing, something like that. The rest of it was gone. Went to the Malvinas Islands, according to Argentinian language. It was then owned by the British, and they called them the Falkland Islands. The captain told him that there was two different kinds of foxes, one on the East Falkland, one on the West Falkland. So he knew they were South American in character, but they were different from island to island, and this is the first time he made that observation. So he's really seeing that isolation, separation, tends to lead to divergence, and these things, they recognizably belong to the same clade, but they are not identical, they are consistently different. About 12 kilometers up the Valdivia River is the town itself. Darwin was actually resting on the banks in a nothofagus forest when this enormous earthquake hits. I think that's when he wrote his famous essay, just called February 1835. It's the first place that he uses the phrase birth as well as death of species. He talks about the birth and death of species. He invokes Brockie in terms of the ingrained, inborn lifespans of species. Lyell had criticized that because he says it's not like grafting trees. The grafting showed that there was something genetic about it that changed the genetics of all of the derived plants that you come from a tree that's been grafted, and they all share the same sort of propensity to die around the same time, the same ability or lack of it to bear good fruit. And Lyell said there's nothing like that I could understand that would be at the level of species. And Darwin says, why not? Maybe it's just built into the reproductive process or something. So he's actively toying with Brockie's ideas.
I think that it is quite possible that it's something that Darwin got from Brockie, and if he didn't get it from Brockie, he may have got it from Brockie at secondhand in other sorts of ways. I think that a figure like Brockie has been much underestimated just because the work wasn't really translated properly.
Wants to see compare the fauna flora of mainland South America with the island groups, the Galapagos, or on the equator. He goes there. It makes no sense out of the finches. This is a confusing melange. He's not worried about adaptation. He's not doing anything like that. He's looking for patterns of replacement. That's what he's looking for. And fortunately, the mockingbirds there, they look very much like the Chilean penca, which is a mockingbird. The one on the west coast is most similar to the ones in the Galapagos, and he notices that they're different from island to island. So he's really intrigued with that. And later on in the trip, when he writes it up, he gets to this fact. He says that if these Galapagos mockingbirds basically bear out, if they're true, the zoology of archipelagos will be well worth examining, as such patterns basically undermine the stability of species. And he went back and he tucked in the word would undermine, just in case the captain picked it up and read it. Any historian reads that agrees that he was clearly an evolutionist by that time. And of course, I think he was, going all the way back to Bahia Blanca in 1832, but I can't prove it and I don't care. I mean, we know what the final end result was.
If I could be transported back to one moment in history, certainly one of the moments I would really like to be transported back to is when Darwin and John Herschel were talking in the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of Africa. Because right at that time, Herschel is writing letters to Charles Lyell, who is a key figure in this story. And those letters are really Herschel saying, it talks about what he says, the mystery of mysteries, and that, we don't know what this law is, but the law of succession of how new beings come into being, and getting a scientific explanation for that. That's a really big and important question. And Darwin was full of all this speculation and interesting material about this, and Herschel was full of it too. It's very hard not to believe that Darwin got a certain push toward thinking, okay, I can really think about this a little bit more, in fact, quite a lot more concretely here.
But 1844, and he writes a letter to Leonard Jennings, Henslow's brother-in-law, and he had been offered the job on the Beagle before Darwin was. He writes to Jennings, I did not come to these ideas from wondering about what's a variety and what's a species. In other words, patterns of similarity and intergradation between things. That was not what drove him there. He says it's more like species or like individuals, with their separate births and deaths and so forth. That's how I got there. And that's Brockie.
My sense is that he's writing quite a lot of notes which are quite private, and the really smoking gun notes are, of course, famously on the very late part of the voyage.
when he was on the Beagle, and in his earliest essay, for instance, Red Notebook, when he got home, he's a confirmed evolutionist, but he's not talking about adaptation. There's no adaptation whatsoever. He started off Notebook B, which I think is the single most important thing he ever wrote, with homage to his grandfather. He called it zoonomia. And he's interested in reproduction, and he's interested in how you can get adaptation.
How are you going to take that kind of very speculative 18th century theorizing that his grandfather was engaged in, but make it so it's respectable and really fits the kind of new mode of the 19th century, you know, really modern theorizing about that takes accounts of observations and facts.
I'm paraphrasing this. I know that there's going to be a natural law. I don't have it figured out yet, but I know it has something to do with reproduction, sexual reproduction he was thinking about, and also variation, heritable variation in organisms. So then the question becomes, when and under what circumstances in the history of a species or the origin of a new species is adaptation triggered as a process? He said Lamarck was more nearly correct than I ever supposed, and he seems more correct now in 1837 this would be. So one of the possibilities is simply you just roll the clock, let the geological ages roll, and species will automatically, or there'll be this mechanism that will track environmental change perhaps, or whatever it is, and inevitably species will change through time. So that was one model that he had. And then he said things like, if you put the ancient ibis on a separate island, then it probably would have changed. So he was very much aware of and in favor of interpreting adaptive change as coming through, very often at least, through isolation. And the curious thing is he had lots of data for that. He had lots of examples from his field work in South America. He had no data supporting the notion that species change gradually through time, which is what Lamarck had claimed, but everybody said Lamarck had no real data to support that either. I think the main reason why it took, 30 years and certainly 10 years since Darwin was involved thinking about these things to bring adaptation in, particularly since we see it as so central to the whole question of evolution, was that the topic had been basically commandeered by William Paley. I think he wrote his book, first edition, in 1802. It was about natural philosophy, and what he said basically was the famous analogy: if you find a watch on the beach as you walk along, you know somebody made that watch. So likewise, if you see a complex organism like a tree or like a butterfly, somebody had to make it, and it was God. So I think Darwin needed to get his ducks in a row before he could actually tackle this problem. Once he knew new species arose, he wanted to find out the natural laws behind the changes in the behaviors and anatomies, the adaptive change that actually occurs willy-nilly along with the origin of species. It's unbelievable. These two remarkable passages on adjacent pages, page 58 and 59 of Notebook E. He has his eureka moment. He's been reading Thomas Malthus, really nice passages about Thomas Malthus. Malthus points out that, at least for the human species, there's a limitation to population growth. Here he says, three principles will account for all. This is natural selection. Grandchildren like grandfathers, that's inheritance. Tendency to small change, especially with environmental change. That means variation, heritable variation. And the Malthus point number 3, great fertility in populations to supportive parents. Meaning more children are born each generation that can possibly survive and reproduce and replace their parents. It's much more, so there's something that's controlling them. There was a conflict because he did not see how isolation could occur easily enough on these homogeneously looking vast areas like the pampas of northern Argentina and the Patagonian plains, the arid plains. So he wrote to me, one of the most stunning, simple, it's a one-sentence long paragraph detailing his thoughts about this conflict. He says, if separation in horizontal direction, that's isolation, geographic isolation, is far more efficient in making species then time, which would be the gradual just passage of time, as the cause of change, which can hardly be believed, he says, then uniformity in geological formation intelligible. In other words, what we later on called stasis. What that is, it says that he's got punctuated equilibria in there. He's got isolation in geographically and then great stability through time. And if that's the model that is predominant, that's what you would expect. You wouldn't expect things to just keep gradually changing. And that would explain why there's no examples in the fossil record. But he can't believe it. He can't believe it's true. So he rejects it right there. And to me, that's the fulcrum of all of Darwin's thinking. Because after that, he mostly stresses that gradual change through time. And isolation becomes very muted, very only occasionally acknowledged in all his other writings, including The Origin of Species.
Well, I think one thing just to stress is just how radically incomplete Darwin, Lyell, and that school thought the record was. People had talked about the missing page in the Book of Life. They're talking about whole chapters missing. It's just as though you took this book, I'm not going to do it, but, and you have an odd paragraph here, a little bit there. So the boundary between what they call the secondary and the tertiary period, basically between what we would think of as the death of the dinosaurs and the origins of the modern Cenozoic period, Darwin and Lyell thought that that period was longer than the entire history of life since the dinosaurs. That one little gap in the geological record.
If you look at The Origin of Species, by the time you got there, isolation is just a tiny little bit of his arguments in there. It's all about this gradual change through time, and if you don't find any evidence for it, fine. That means the fossil record is poor.